Look, I wouldn't call myself a true crime junkie or anything, but I do enjoy a good episode of Dateline NBC. In fact, I've been watching Dateline since before it switched to its present all true crime all the time format. I've been watching Dateline since it debuted in 1992, when it was a general interest news magazine like 60 Minutes or 2020. Although 2020 is mostly true crime now too, isn't it? Trust me, kids, there used to be primetime news magazines other than 60 Minutes that reported on stuff besides true crime. I know because I was there. Anyway, I still watch Dateline and listen to it since they release episodes in podcast form now as well. And just recently, I was watching when Andrea Canning reported on the strange story of Nicholas Alaverdian. I'm not going to tell you the whole story here. Go watch the Dateline episode for that. You should. It's a hell of a story. I'll just give you the broad outline so you have some context if you don't know the story, because there's one bit right at the end of this Dateline episode that I want to focus on. So, long story short, Nicholas Alaverdian is a 30-something guy who grew up mostly in foster care in Rhode Island, became an advocate for reforming the foster care system in that state, sexually assaulted a fellow college student, an act for which he was convicted and forced to register as a sex offender, was married and divorced a couple of times, charged with domestic violence, investigated by the FBI for fraud for obtaining credit cards in the name of one of his former foster parents and racking up $200,000 in debt, moved to Europe, got married again, announced he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, was reported to have died in 2020, then was found alive in a Scottish hospital in 2021 where he was being treated for COVID under an assumed name, at which point he was arrested by Scottish police on another sexual assault charge, this one connected to a rape he allegedly committed in Utah in 2008. I'm leaving out a bunch of details, and that's not even the end. After his arrest in Scotland, Alaverdian claimed he was innocent and that this was all a case of mistaken identity. He was not Nicholas Alaverdian from the United States. He said he was Arthur Knight from England. He appeared in court and at press conferences using a wheelchair and always wearing an oxygen mask necessary because he'd been weakened by COVID, he said, and speaking in the most hilariously phony British accent you've ever heard. If he was actually Arthur Knight, how did he explain the fact that he had tattoos and fingerprints identical to those of Nicholas Alaverdian? He claimed police applied matching tattoos to his body while he was in a medically induced coma during his COVID hospitalization, and that the corrupt American authorities switched the fingerprints when they were sent to the U.S. for comparison to make it appear that his were a match for Alaverdian's. Sounds totally plausible to me. Why the skepticism, Edinburgh Sheriff Court? Anyway, here's the point I'm trying to get to. Alaverdian, aka Arthur Knight, has been trying to avoid extradition to the U.S. to face the Utah rape charge by employing a series of increasingly desperate delaying tactics, including faking seizures, accusing prosecutors of being members of sex cults, and just straight up refusing to appear for court hearings. But all of those antics may not even be necessary. A Scottish attorney interviewed for the Dateline story says in the closing minutes of the report that even if the court finds that Alaverdian should be extradited to the U.S., it could be years before that happens because Scotland has strict human rights protocols and will not extradite Alaverdian unless Scottish courts are satisfied that his treatment as a prisoner will be up to the standards set by the European Convention on Human Rights. In other words, Nicholas Alaverdian, convicted sex offender and accused rapist and fraudster, might actually succeed in his effort to avoid facing justice for his crimes in the United States, not through any cleverness of his own, of which he seems to have none, audacity, yes, cleverness not so much, but because the American penal system is such a shit show that the Scottish authorities can't send him back here without violating their own human rights laws. And the thing is, I know there were quite a few of my fellow Americans who watched this episode of Dateline who rolled their eyes when that Scottish attorney said that. Oh, those Europeans won't extradite our criminals because we don't coddle our prisoners like they do. That's a typical attitude among people here in the United States, where we tend to view human rights protections with the same wary detachment with which more sensible people regard lavish, indulgent desserts. Sure, they're nice, but not everybody can have them, and too many of them will make you soft. There's a common assumption that criminals forfeit the right to humane treatment, that severe conditions in jails and prisons aren't anything worth worrying about because if you're convicted of a crime, you pretty much deserve what you get. Don't do the crime if you can't do the time, to quote the Eighth Amendment to our Constitution. I get it, up to a point. When most people picture a generic criminal in their minds, they probably aren't thinking of like a tax cheat or non-violent drug offender. They're thinking of a murderer, a gangster, a child abuser, someone who has destroyed lives, someone who represents a danger to society. It's difficult to sympathize with someone like that. Nicholas Alaverdian falls into that category, I'd say, accused of multiple sex crimes, accused of defrauding people for hundreds of thousands of dollars, attempting to escape the consequences of his actions by faking his own death, pretending to be somebody else, and lying in the most transparent and insulting ways imaginable when he gets caught. I mean, to hell with that guy. Would I care if he, as an individual, was mistreated while in prison? No. I have no sympathy for him. But we don't protect human rights on a case-by-case basis. Rights apply to everyone. That's what makes them rights. And the rights we choose to protect say something about who we are as a society. When we guarantee the basic rights of everyone, including criminals, when we take steps to ensure that the accused will receive a fair trial and have access to competent representation, and to ensure that the punishments faced by convicts will be fair and humane, we are telling the rest of the world, and most importantly, telling ourselves, that we are just, rational, civilized people. If we want to be that sort of people, we need, among other things, to treat our prisoners well. Even scumbags like Nicholas Alaverdian. Handling prisoners with respect for their basic humanity is not a sign of weakness or corruption. Lots of folks sure seem to think it is, though, don't they? There's this prevailing attitude that justice, particularly for the worst, most violent criminals, must be as harsh and wantonly cruel as possible, or else it's not really justice. Viewed in this way, justice is less about protecting society from dangerous people or rehabilitating criminals, and more about allowing the rest of us to experience a catharsis, to feel like the bad people got what they deserve. Again, to a degree, I get it. Emotionally, I get it. Does my heart bleed for fraudster sex criminals like Nicholas Alaverdian? No. Do I give a shit if some rapist or serial killer or mafioso gets his head bounced off the hood of a cop car or takes a beating in prison? Not really. Fuck him. But do I want a system where those sorts of things are allowed to happen without repercussions? No, I don't. Because if that's the system, then those sorts of things can happen to anyone. Because we are all subject to that system, not just the gangsters and the rapists and the serial killers. All of us. We react to terrible crimes and the people who commit them with anger and revulsion. Of course we do. It's only natural that we might want people who do horrible things to suffer as a result. But we don't have a vengeance system. We have a justice system. Or at least that's the idea. If you think the system lets someone off too easy, you always have the option of taking care of it yourself. It wouldn't be legal, of course, and I don't recommend it. But if you feel that strongly about it, you can find whoever that is out on the street and give them the beating or whatever you think they deserve. You live out your own revenge fantasies, and you deal with the consequences. Don't demand that the state do it for you. And honestly, If we did have a criminal justice system, particularly a prison system here in the US that was more up to internationally recognized human rights standards, it's not as if a bunch of people would be running out to do crimes just to get locked up in a nice, comfortable state penitentiary. A humanely operated prison is still a place most of us aren't going to want to be. I remember back, 13, 14 years ago, someone in the right-wing media, maybe on Fox News, I can't recall specifically, got their hands on a photograph of a restraint chair that was supposedly being prepared for Osama bin Laden, were he to be found and captured. The chair had leather straps to restrain the prisoner at the arms and legs and chest, but the straps had a soft lining on the inside where they would contact the skin. And the chair also had a padded seat and back. And since this was during the Obama administration, conservative commentators jumped all over the image as perhaps the ultimate example of the Democratic Party's alleged softness on crime. They spoke as though President Obama himself had personally ordered a custom restraint chair for bin Laden. I want padding on the straps as well as the back and the seat. The mastermind of 9/11 must only have the best. It never seemed to occur to any of them that the restraint chair just came that way, that the features they regarded as customizations intended to see to the comfort of the world's most infamous terrorist were standard. Plus, it's still a restraint chair. Yeah, it's got a cushioned seat. Yeah, the straps are lined so they won't chafe, but would you want to be the one forced to sit in it? Padding or no padding, you're strapped to a chair. But this is America, where to show a criminal anything less than maximum brutality is to pamper that criminal. Human rights are for innocent people. And also for me, innocent or guilty. I demand that my rights be protected. This is me we're talking about. Come on! Another country, especially an ally like Scotland, which is a constituent of the United Kingdom, the country with which the United States has a special relationship, refusing to extradite criminals out of concern for our human rights practices should be embarrassing to us as Americans. It should make us examine ourselves. Really? Have we driven this thing that far off the road that Scotland isn't sure they want to send back one of our own sex offenders because they're concerned we won't be able to meet their minimum legal standards for how prisoners ought to be treated? That should give us pause, shouldn't it? If the Scottish courts are prepared to keep this Alaverdian asshole over there and put up with his lying and his clowning around, hiding his face behind an oxygen mask, pretending he's too weak to stand, talking in that insultingly half-assed approximation of an English accent, Scottish people probably get pissed off enough when they hear a genuine one of those. If they're prepared to keep him and put up with all of that, rather than just ship him back over here to let us deal with him, that should inspire us to look within, to experience a moment of clarity, to realize just how far down we have slipped. This is a single, relatively unimportant example. Nicholas Alaverdian is just one criminal. There are 2 million people incarcerated in American prisons, jails, and other detention facilities. As recently as 2018, the United States had the highest per capita incarceration rate in the entire world. As of this year, the United States has the 6th highest incarceration rate, but one of the 5 countries ahead of us on the list is American Samoa, which is a territory of the United States. The other 4 are Cuba, Turkmenistan, Rwanda, and El Salvador. The land of the free! Not all of those 2 million incarcerated Americans are living in brutal, inhumane circumstances, but it sure seems like lots of them are. For the past several years, the U.S. Department of Justice has been investigating prisons in the state of Georgia, uncovering evidence of rampant sexual assault of prisoners, overcrowding, abuse of LGBTQ inmates, and, quote, horrific, unhygienic living conditions. This past February in the state of West Virginia, the Poor People's Campaign filed a federal class action lawsuit representing nearly 1,000 current and former inmates against the West Virginia Division of Corrections, alleging that overcrowding, inadequate staffing, pervasive violence, and crumbling infrastructure has led to living conditions for inmates which one of the lawyers involved in the case has described as comparable to a Russian gulag in the 1950s. And what about Utah, the state to which Nicholas Alaverdian would be transferred if his extradition goes through? A quick Google search brought up this article from last year reporting on an audit that revealed, quote, systemic deficiencies in the health care of the state's prison system during the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to at least 18 prisoner deaths. There's also this article from 2020 where a corrections officer describes Utah State Prison, which has since been closed, as, quote, hell on earth. And this article from this past November, which quotes both corrections officers and inmates as saying that the brand new Utah State Correctional Facility, the one they built to replace the one that closed, is violent, operated by poorly trained staff, inadequately equipped to tend to the healthcare needs of the inmates, and overrun by mosquitoes. If Nicholas Alaverdian was a fugitive from another country, where the prison conditions were as bad as they are in Georgia or West Virginia or Utah, and American law enforcement captured him here, would we send him back? What am I saying? Of course we would. Hell, we'd probably only refuse to extradite criminals to countries that have prisons with better conditions than ours. What's that? Your detention facilities are clean, you don't practice solitary confinement, and your correction system is built around rehabilitation rather than punishment? Fuck it, we're keeping him. Because here in the good old US of A, we know how to handle prisoners harshly and in bulk.